So welcome everyone to our webinar series. My name is Raphael Ng and I am a member of the Committee of Junior HTCS Scholars organizing this webinar series on multidimensional well-being. So this is the third of our series session, and we have the privilege of having José Manuel Roche join us today to talk about the methodological options and challenges for measuring multidimensional well-being. Jose has a very broad competency, both as a researcher as well as a practitioner in the international development field. As a specialist advisor and consultant, he worked with the UNDP, as well as the UNICEF, the World Bank, and Asian Development Bank, and also with international NGOs such as Save the Children, where he was chief researcher, Oxfam United for Global Mental Health, to name just a few. So in more academic areas, he is working as a research associate at the Oxford Department of International Development in OPHI, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Jose co-authored a book titled Multidimensional Poverty Measurement and Analysis, published by Oxford University Press, and I'll provide a link which will be included in your chat later on. He's widely published also in many other journals, amongst others. Let me pull the information out just briefly. Sorry about the delay. So Jose is also published in other journals, such as in the World Development, the Journal of International Development, Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, Social Indicators, Research, and Work, Employment, and Society. So here is our speaker for today. We also have Kate Solis and Sebastian Ostland joining us today as interlocutors. They will be seeding your questions to Jose as we go along. So we organized this webinar series with the intention of facilitating discussion. So please do write your questions on our Q&A, even as Jose is presenting, so that we can group them together, organize them, and then seed them together with related topics. So please also use the chat function for comments and the Q&A function for your questions for Jose. You could also upvote any questions that are similar to yours in the Q&A function. And as a matter of etiquette, please formulate your question by opening with a keyword or short phrase. This will help us to organize your questions in the appropriate sets of questions that other people have also seeded. If you feel that you might have an extended inquiry that you could build on with responses and follow-up questions, we also have the option of enabling you to directly speak and ask your questions to Jose and to develop the discussion further. If you would like to do so, please send me or the panelists a message to let us know, and we'll add you on the queue and enable that function so that you could also speak. So this session is recorded, but only the panelists are recorded. And of course, if you get to speak, then naturally your voice will be recorded as well. And for the sequence of this webinar, it's pretty straightforward. We have a bit about the etiquette presently, and then Jose will make a 15-20 minute presentation mapping the various methods and multidimensional well-being. The rest of the time is really dedicated to questions and discussion. So please seed your questions generously. Our back office colleagues, myself and Travis, will try our best to package them all together, and the session should end at then 12:30 British Standard Time, British Summer Time. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jose, who will now then share his slides.
Hello, everyone. I suppose say hello, good morning, and good afternoon, depending where you are. Maybe really early in some places. Well, thank you for the invitation first. I think this is a great initiative, the whole webinar series you put together. In particular now, during time of COVID, that is so difficult to get together in the same place, and we don't have the conference happening, but well, these topics are really, really important for the capability approach. And we were discussing off camera of the webinar how many of the methodological discussions on how to operationalize the approach are often not written, or are written in papers, many different papers doing different type of analysis, but not so much in a single piece. And so it's great to be here talking about it. And I remember as a PhD student back in 2004, how difficult it was to get guidance when you were trying to, start thinking on how to put the research into practice, into a more empirical research. And well, we didn't have the summer schools that we have today. We didn't have, internet was just really picking up in a way, more interactive internet, certainly no webinar or anything like this. And so it's really great to have it now, I think, and it's I understand it. This is organized by the graduate network, and many people who are, could be very experienced researchers who work in other area, they be maybe working in social inequality, or, in health, education, whatever area. And they are interested in the capability approach. They maybe relate to it, but they are maybe not working so central. It's not so central to the research. And so I think it's great to have something like this where you can, the different webinars. I listened to some of them, and I think they help you to, give an insight that put you really quickly close to, understanding and having a bit more clarity to then orient yourself in the literature. So I think it's great. It's great that you're putting together. So really happy to be here. We are talking today and mostly about methods and methodologies, and we wanted to make it very practical. So not to discuss so much the say the more technical background of the method, but more how they are put into practice in actual research, whether it's academic research or around policy research. And so what we're going to have is more a conversation, both with Kate and Sebastian, right? And with everyone who's going to be sharing questions. But we thought that maybe some quick slides would help just to orient ourselves around, the mapping of what we're discussing today. So that's what I put together. I don't have too many slides here, but perhaps the most important to say is that I'm keeping it quite simple, and I will try through the conversation to keep it quite simple. So we'll have people who are coming from many different backgrounds here, and so the idea is that even people who don't work on measurement but are interested on operationalizing it, or what are the implications of putting it into practice, and are, for different reasons want to link to this discussion, can also understand it. So I'm gonna try to keep it really down in what respect to, more technical discussion. And so I produced this little cartoon I find fantastic on how this hen is becoming too difficult with all the formulas. And things that are expressing formulas or notations are, of course, very precise, and they have their space, but you can, of course, explain the same things in different ways. And so that's what we're going to try to do today. And maybe important is to to flag what is the core message. You know, I was thinking, what if you remember something from this session, what should it be? And so this would be the core message I like to share. And it's, well, any theory, you know, any conceptual theory framework is you know, difficult to put into practice, whether it's, you know, quantitative or qualitative or in policies, but turning something that is more conceptual into something practical is always challenging, and especially when it comes to research. And the capability is far from an exception, because it's, of course, a approach that relates to complexity without shame, which is chooses by definition to approach well-being and the topic in a more complex way. And so this, you know, the capability, I just wanted to say that the capability is not an exception. You know, I've been working for a long time, for example, on social class analysis and stratification in sociology. And the theories can be extremely complex as well. And they are also quite difficult to put them into metrics or research. And so it just, you know, often the most interesting the theory, the most complicated it is to put it into practice. But that's fine. That's what it is. And so the second point is that, and this maybe relates to something that the previous two webinars been discussing, that is that the capability approach counts. There's not a single way to do things. There's an array of measurement approaches in the capability approach. And well, the most appropriate tool for your work, or how to tailor it to your particular work, depend on the research and the context of the research. It depends, and I would say, I can't say this more you know, strongly. It depends, of course, on your research question. What is that you are trying to answer? And that's going to determine a lot the decision that you make. It depends on the conceptual approach that you follow, and because we don't have a single capability approach, and because we combine the capability approach with many other theories, then there are going to be different ways in which you are going to tailor the methods. And then, very important, which we'll have time to discuss quite a lot, especially during the conversation, is that there's a lot of practical methodological questions that you ask yourself when you are doing the research. No least the resources you have, you know, how much time you have, how much, you know, either money or possibility you have to go and do field work or go to places, how many people can work in it, you know. Two more practical questions: how is it going to be used, what data you're using, you know, and that all determine also the way you tailor the method. So it's, you know, there's not a single way then, but there's a range of different approaches. And then the last point is that the methodological decisions are not value-free often. And dealing with issues concerning with values, as I said here, remain quite central to the capability approach. And perhaps this is something you know, it can be unsettling to people who want to see research as being quite, let's say, objective in a way. But for many who work in the capability approach, this is just exciting. It's exciting that we are dealing with issues of values, and we deal with that systematically and openly, and it's open, among other things, to debate. And so that's absolutely fine, and it's central to the capability approach as well. And so those would be the sort of core message that I would love to keep. But you know, I'd be happy to, during the conversation, to be challenged as well if you think that perhaps it's not exactly like that. And so where to seek guidance? I mean, many of what I'm going to talk here is based on work that we've done, or really good reference literature that is out there, there's of course a huge amount of papers that put the capability approach in practice, but some try to also summarize the different approaches. And so back in 2009 with Enrique Chiapero, we put together this chapter where we were discussing the techniques and empirical applications. And we base a lot of the work that we did there as well on previous work of Brandolini and D'Alessio that did a really good work back in 1998. I understand that chapter is also in the same book from Fondazione Feltrinelli. And then the great work of Kuklis as well, that discusses really well very important methodological issues. And more recently, in the book with colleagues in OFI, with Sabina, James, and others in OFI, some chapters there discuss more methodological issues as well that are not specifically only to the capability, but it does engage also with methodological issues on the capability approach. And so if if when you hear me, you want to sort of look for other insights, but that are a little bit general, so you don't go directly into a particular technique, you can go to some of these. And these, I'm sure, there's other that you can also access. And back, maybe very important is that back in 2009 or before, actually, with Enrique, we were putting together a data bank with research that have operationalized the capability approach, and is in the website of the HCCA. It's in an earlier version is in the chapter in that book where we review different papers or work, and we discuss different elements of the methodology, including the method they use, or what type of source, or what was the focus, whether in functioning or capabilities, what indicators they use, and how many dimensions, and so on. And it's just really useful to go through, the wealth of different approaches and to learn from them. Like you can just see here how you could have in some 46 indicators, but in other you would have 4 or 3. The range is huge. And the methods are very diverse. This is only the first 5 here, but if you go to the website, you'll find a much longer list. We had, I think the website still need to be tweaked, because we produced this in the earlier website that we had back in 2009, 2008. And when the migration of the website went from that old version to the current one, some things got a little bit lost and not quite well organized. So it need to probably be sorted. That was organized with the quantitative method group. So there's a little bit of work for anyone who's interested to put it together and fix it. But so this is where we started, Enrique and I, looking at different research and seeing how it had been put into practice. And so what maybe before I go into that summary, I can give you a little bit of an idea of what we found. And so what we found is that most of the research primarily focuses on functionings, or the so-called refined functionings, with the attempt to measure or to approximate to capabilities. But many of the research are then working with actually achievement functionings. A plurality of domain also consider from 3 to 14 different domains, sometimes measured with a single indicator or a very large set of indicators in each domain. Some of the research pay attention to human diversity, for example. Others won't, but they may focus, for example, on what's the different, gender differences of age, different disability or ethnic groups and different contexts. Some research addresses developing countries, but there's of course quite a lot of work in developed countries. It's even more now, many years later. And they make equal use of both aggregate figures, as in macro data that are already aggregated, or use microdata set where you have data for individuals or households. And they are generally based on secondary data, in that it uses data that have been collected for other purpose, and then it's interpret and analyze with a capability approach lens. But there's also some research that have done primary gathering with them for the purpose of their research. And so that gives you a little of an idea of what we found then. And of course, there's way more research now done with different approaches as well. But they all have something in common. So when you try to operationalize a capability approach, there are at least three key elements. The first one is the data requirement. So you often require, for a plurality of evaluative space, you want to have possibly some data on standard of living, well-being, or resources. It could be your income or consumption, asset that you own, and so on. You also want to have data and information on achievement functioning, whether it may be education, health, could be about empowerment, subjective well-being, violence, employment, you name it, the long list of different capabilities. You may want to have, of course, information on capability per se, or even more around agency empowerment. And then researchers also want to have a plurality of domain. We often say that the capability approach well-being from a multidimensional perspective. So you want to have different dimensions, sometimes called dimensions, sometimes called domains, but you want to have different elements of the well-being of people. Then you want to have a plurality unit of analysis as well, that reflect human diversity, on all the discussion, for example, around conversion factors, and when you want to look at inequalities and different, different level of achievement for different groups. And you also want to have a plurality of context as well. And so the next point had to do with the type of data you use. And so in a, say, simplified way, you may use macro data or micro data. So the macro data is data that is being aggregated at a certain level. I say macro here could be at the country level, for example, when you are doing analysis of development progress and you use either the Human Development Index or any other index or set of indicators at a country level that have been computed for many diverse type of sources. They could use census and surveys, and it may use administrative records and so on, and it's putting together that into a set of indicators. So you may have really complex measurement approaches there. So for example, something like life expectancy is computed by demographers with quite precise data and modeling that then allows you to have such a good indicator. But the same applies for child mortality. Demographers would then adjust what comes out of census and surveys, and then they would make a better estimation of mortality rate and fecundity or whatever it is that you're working on. And so those are macro data, but that macro data can also be computed at, say, state level. So you may be working in India and you want to see the differences between different regions in India or in any other country. And often you find the data, or it could be the municipality. So the aggregation there is just an aggregation at a certain level. And that level could also be groups. You may have data for certain groups that you are monitoring. You know, it could be disabled and non-disabled, children, adults, and so on. But it's aggregated data at the macro level. Microdata, on the other hand, is data that is what people call data set. Well, microdata can be data set too, but when it's more surveys. So you have surveys where the observation is either the individual or the household. And so you have data for everyone who's in the sample, or everyone if it's a census, and you have data for each individual, each household. And then you yourself use the microdata to aggregate the data from there. And so you have these two broad type of data, and of course the different type of analysis and method you use depend on the data that you have at hand. And then you have primary data collection that you may use. You could have also secondary data use of microdata, or you could have secondary use data of aggregate data that wasn't done for the same purpose, but you're using it. And so you have all these different type of data. If you have primary data collection, then you are collecting exactly or as close as you can to what you need. But you need, of course, more resources in order to collect data. And so that's why most research is done normally with macro data or micro data, as in with surveys as a secondary use of surveys. So, for example, the demographic health surveys or the mix from UNICEF and so on, because it gives you a much bigger picture. You have data from the whole country with much more representativeness that you would if you are only collecting data for yourself, if you're collecting data as primary data collection. And then in terms of techniques, there's, well, I just listed here a few, and we can talk about them later in the conversation, but you could have, of course, a dashboard of indicator with no aggregation, and Amartya Sen with John Dress in the books, they often are using a dashboard of indicator. They're referring to different type of data to discuss something that is more complex and rich. So you don't necessarily need to aggregate, but you could aggregate. And then there are different approaches. You have a scaling and ranking solution like the HDI and other indices of that type. Some are called axiomatic approaches. I'll explain that a little bit later, but because they try to meet certain properties. You have, of course, fuzzy set, principal component, factor analysis, regression, or structural equation models, and so on. But one method you use depends on the research question you have. As I said earlier, it depends also on the type of data that you're using. It would depend on the research question that you are trying to answer, and so on. And well, I'm not going to go in detail, but in the paper with Enrica, we highlighted some of the strengths and weaknesses and some of these methods. And in the book on multidimensional poverty with colleagues from OFI, there's also a really good discussion about how far certain methods can take you. For example, fuzzy set theory or multivariate data reduction techniques, factor analysis or structural equation models is discussed in some detail also in the book with Ofi. And so just the last slide here before we go into the conversation. And this is where I get more excited, which is that, well, what is common in all the methods is that you have to deal with values anyway. And researchers especially in the capability approach, aim to deal with values quite systematically and quite transparently, trying to make very clear what are the values and choices they are making. And so I'm just listing here a few of those typical values that you make. And so one of them had to do with something that you may not think is necessarily a value, but it's a unit of analysis. So you need to choose what is going to be your unit of analysis in your research. We said that you may be comparing countries or you may be comparing people. And in most cases, that's defined by the research question. So it's, your interest is expressed already on your question, what you want to find out. But sometimes it may be the result of data limitations as well. So it could be that you don't have microdata, and so you have to use data aggregated, which often would mean that unless there's an aggregated indicator on inequalities, you may not be able to include inequalities, for example, or certain elements that you don't have. So data delimitation may be one factor that limits your what unit of analysis you are focusing. And so, for example, you may be overlooking gender intra-household inequality when you use certain type of household surveys that don't collect data on intra-household inequalities. Or it could be that the data misses certain type of groups that are important, disabled or ethnic minorities and so on. And so there's, of course, by default, a choice being made there on what you are going to say or not say in your research. And even if it's a result of, just a practical decision because of what you can access, there is an implicit value there in what you choose. And so the next point is the evaluation space. And of course, the whole capability approach emphasizes how the ultimate evaluation shouldn't be the one of resources or means like income. It should be capabilities. But when you come to research, depending on your research question and data sometimes, or even your theoretical approach, you may focus on something different. So for example, you may be, in the less contested example, you may use achieve functioning. So for example, you may be working with malnutrition, or you may be working with education achievement or other or such achievement. And if you are studying, for example, an analysis on inequality between horizontal inequality, inequality between groups, you may be satisfied with looking at functioning and looking at very basic or refined functionings that are so fundamental that they already bring a light on the type of capabilities capability sets that people may access. So for example, if you have something like in the poverty metrics where you have access to being literate or child mortality, or you're looking at nutrition, they are such basic functionings that if you are deprived of those functioning, then you, of course, most likely are deprived of a really wide range of other functionings and capability sets. And so you may be satisfied to focus on the functionings, or you may be studying because your focus is on education and the link between nutrition and education. You may be only working with those two, and that's fine. So it'll be the type of analysis you are doing. In some other cases, researcher may actually try to measure capability more directly or more closely. And that's the case, for example, with the work on multiple structural equation, when they are measuring the capability functionings through a set of indicators, and then they try to assess the determinants of those capabilities. But, in some research, you may also want to look at resources. If you're looking, for example, at social protection measures and cash transfer, and you want to see the effect of cash transfer, for example, on protecting vulnerable household in type of crisis. It could be cash transfer during humanitarian crisis. Well, you are going to be also looking at resources and looking at how those resources are converted into functionings, and so how they are assigned, who are receiving them, and so on. And so you may also be looking at resources, because resources, of course, is still a very important element. You may also be looking, for example, at a more macro level, the number of hospitals that exist, the number of doctors, and the type of resources that are assigned in the health system, and how that's leading to produce different inequalities across, Nigeria, for example, where some regions are more better provided than others. And part of your advice may be that resources need to be distributed more equitable. So, for example, in a recent research we did on education, we were making the case on how you may have to assign more budget per student in certain type of regions in Nigeria, because you needed more resources in order to achieve the same level of outcomes, whereas in other regions with less resources you were achieving the same. So achieving the same level of resources was producing in the end quite wide inequalities in what you wanted to achieve, which is improving learning outcomes. And so your point is that you may be looking, of course, at resources as well. And there is, different reason why you would do one way or another, but there's ultimately, of course, a question about values as well. And then perhaps the most important one, or not the most important, but one of the most important, is the choice of dimensions or domains. So whose values are, why are certain domain or dimension included and not others? And so again, the choice there may be partly the result of research question. You may be focusing only on a subset of important dimensions, or it could be the result of data constraint. You have to use only certain type of data. But the discussion on what dimensions should be included, even when you have data constraint, the best practice in the capability approach is to discuss what should be the dimensions to include for the particular work that you are doing, and why is that you are not including all of those dimensions. Even if you are missing some, you need to explain why you are not including them, and why is that you are reaching certain type of dimensions. So, for example, some research may be focusing on the sustainable development goals, and you may be taking the framework of the SDGs as a level of consensus, and then you may be doing the analysis based on that framework. But you may, be working in another areas. So, for example, you may be working in child rights, and you may be using the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child. And so you have a framework there that you use, but you could, of course, use different ways to reach public deliberation, right? You can also do participatory research to consult, for example, a community where perhaps you're doing a more concrete research, and you may be evaluating, for example, the impact of a certain intervention or program, and you possibly decide to apply participatory methods to see what people value in relation to that method, what people value in relation to that intervention or project that is being put in practice, and then you use the dimensions that people consider most important to then also do the evaluation of the same program. So you could bring here different type of approaches, but ultimately the choice of dimension is is deeply grounded on the values that you assign. And there's a question on indicators, and I put indicator here also in relation to value, because the indicator that you use, and you know, the same dimension may not be measured with the same indicator. You be choosing from a range of indicators, and you choose normally the best possible measure for the dimensions that you have. So for example, if you are looking at health or mobility, for example, you have different ways to measure it. And you may look at a single indicator or a set of indicators, you may aggregate or not. And some of the discussion is, of course, technical. So there's a wide discussion of how accurate certain type of metrics or indicators may be. So for example, we know that life expectancy is a really good metric that capture much more than just your longevity. It captures the whole range of, you know, based on the table of mortality rate. So it looks at your whole cycle of life and your health. And so it's a really good indicator beyond the specific area that is you know, specifically defined. But it's also, you know, there's also a lot of experience and research put into how to compute it. And so, you know, that's a really good indicator. So some of the discussion is technical, but it's not only technical. There's level where the discussion is also, it also comes down to values. So for example, when you think in terms of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and you are looking at education, well, there's a huge discussion now where the consensus is being reached much more now, that instead of just looking at an enrollment or progression in education, you need to look at learning outcomes. And so that is not enough just knowing that people are achieving certain level of education, but it's also how much knowledge on math or language they have, reading and writing they have at particular levels. And there are different ways to measure that. And so the discussion ultimately there is, well, what is that we really care about? And what we care about is about the learnings that children gain through education. And so there's, of course, a discussion that comes down to values. And I could come with other examples later as well. For example, inequality and inequality in the SDGs, and how the World Bank proposed an indicator, but you know, it's questionable the extent to which that's the right indicator or not. And the question is not only technical; it's of course deeply related to values. And so then there's another discussion that is on the cutoff or threshold, and that applies particularly to poverty metrics. So when you are doing analysis on poverty, you often, not always, but would decide to have a cutoff or a threshold under which people are considered to be poor, and so you are defining either for each dimension indicator or for the aggregation of them, what is that threshold, and whether it's a sharp threshold, whether it matters how far you are from that level, or whether you move up from that level. And that, of course, is more than just a technical question. It's a question on judgment as well, or what is the minimum, and what is the minimum in abstract, you know, in absolute terms. So for example, if you're thinking about nutrition or calorie intake, but it may also be a question that is contextual. So for example, if you are discussing what is good housing and shelter, then what is appropriate shelter in the UK is not the same as it would be in Burkina Faso. And so there are, you know, and what is appropriate in the UK in the 21st century is not the same as it was appropriate in the UK in the 19th century. So this question there about what is the minimum, whether it's absolute or relative, and that come down, of course, to a discussion that goes beyond strict technicalities. And then perhaps the most challenging is the one related to weight. So when you aggregate indicators into a metric, you need to either intentionally or not assign weight. So you are saying how much certain indicator, how more important certain indicators are going to be with respect to others in the final metric. And you know, in the discussion around weight, often, especially economists would say that the weight and other issues give you a sense of the trade-off. So for example, if you are a policymaker, you need to make a decision between investing in health services or investing in education, schools, or just investing in infrastructure. And policymaker would have to make trade-off because the resources are limited. And so the weight, in a way, also talk about the trade-off, and there's a lot of this, you know, discussion and debate in the HDI or other metric where they discuss of, for example, how many years of life, what's the cost of how many years of life, or how many years of education are equivalent to what in another dimension. So, but something that I find really useful in the discussion around weight is to consider the weight in terms of values. And James Foster has made this point in different contexts when he's talking about metrics. So, and that's, you know, something that it may be a bit unsettling to some economists, but when you are considering weight in a metric, the weight are also telling you how much value is assigned to certain things with respect to others. So for example, when you don't include a dimension in a metric, when it's just not present, in practice, you are assigning a zero weight to that dimension. So you're saying that that dimension is not important at all. But equally, when you're assigning different type of weight, you are giving more or less importance to the different elements. So if you go to the, for example, the MPI, the multidimensional poverty index from UNDP and OFI, you can see how nutrition alone has a much greater weight than some of the asset, the housing asset that individual may have. And so there's you are attributing more importance to certain dimension than other. And so there's different method here, and we can discuss later. No, in some context, you may use data reduction technique to either inform your decision or to actually aggregate. So, for example, when you are doing analysis with more subjective metrics, so for example, if you're looking at psychological well-being or you're looking at empowerment, where you normally have to ask respondent a series of questions on a scale with very many items, then you normally use what psychologists and sociologists refer to validation of a scale. And so you're looking how reliable the scale are, how well they are measuring the concept that is, of course, more complex than the metric that you're using. And you use different techniques. And some of those techniques are factor analysis, for example, that you wouldn't use to assign weight on an MPI, but you would use if you are assigning weight on a more psychological, psychometric scale. So you have different type of method here of aggregation, and we can again discuss it in more detail. And then perhaps the last point before we open up for discussion is the point about the aggregation metric. And so when economists or mathematicians often talk about the formula of the form of the aggregation, no? And you have different type of aggregates. So you have the HDI, for example, is a form of aggregation. The MPI, the Alcaran Foster, is another method of aggregation. And there's different type of indices that aggregate in different ways. And something that is quite useful among those who do that work more on the measurement side is that they look at what they call axiom or properties that the indices should satisfy. And so, for example, some I put there are quite simple. No, you may want the scale to satisfy scale invariance, which is that it doesn't matter whether you measure things in age or month or minutes, you would get the same result. A metric may be poverty focused because you only want to look at the poverty level, or they could be looking at inequality. And then there's this, for example, question of monotonicity or dimensional monotonicity that, for example, the Alcaran Foster method satisfy, which is that for those that are under poverty, if one person who is poor improve the situation, they remain being poor, but they have improved the situation. And imagine all the rest remain the same. We should see a change in the index because improvement, even within poverty level, is something positive. So there are different type of properties that the metric may satisfy or may not satisfy. And those properties, again, some refers to values. So what I just mentioned about monotonicity or dimensional monotonicity, or the number of dimensions in which you are deprived, that's a matter of a value. So you are saying it is better if someone who is poor is less poor, whether in the same dimension or in another dimension, that is better. And so the index should capture it. And the same applies to inequality metrics. You may say, well, what I want to look is at the inequalities at the bottom of the distribution, or I want to put more emphasis at the inequalities at the top of the distribution. So there are different value judgments there. And economists use different type of metrics that assign different values. And when it's well done, that is done quite explicit. So you know what is the value that has been assigned, and you can even have what we call sensitivity analysis. So you can say, if I change the judgment, so if I change the, for example, the emphasis in the top or bottom of the distribution, if I change and not look at monotonicity, if I change the weight and use a different structural weight, or even if I use a different indicator, different cutoff. So you can do different type of sensitivity analysis on all these decisions that you made. Decision that not everyone is going to agree with, but you can do the sensitivity analysis and you may conclude that your finding is robust to a range of decisions or values. And so when it's robust to a range of decisions, then to one extent, the choice you make is not so important because you reach the same conclusion. So for example, if you are analyzing the impact of a particular program, and you are using, again, weights, cutoff, metrics, and so on, and you see that for a range of decision, weights, the dimension that you include, and so on, you reach the same conclusion that it did work, then you will be satisfied with the conclusion, even if you may not agree with the decisions that were made. And so I think I'm going to stop here. And so we can move to a more conversation format, given that this can be, of course, quite heavy. And the idea is more to just to interact all together. So I'm stopping here.
Thank you so much, Jose. That was a really excellent presentation, and I think provides a really good roadmap on the different decisions we can make when applying the capability approach, and some justifications and rationales for why we might choose particular approaches. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking that a little bit more with you. I have there's a number of questions that have come up in my mind, and I know there's a lot of questions in the Q&A as well. So we might just get straight into it. Before we go into some more in-depth discussions, there's a bit of a clarification question that I think would be good to cover first off. And so you use the terms macro and micro, and also aggregated data versus microdata. So if you could just clarify those terms a little bit and give a bit of more background as to how they might be distinguished from each other.
All right. Great, Kate. Well, thanks so much. And you are quite far, no? You are in Australia. So hopefully we all keep awake. So yeah, micro, it can get a bit confusing, but let's start with microdata. So microdata is often referred to a household survey. So you have collected, or someone, could be the Office of Statistics or you name it, have collected data with a questionnaire, normally at a household level, and they have data for every individual in that household. That data is in a database, normally is anonymized, so you don't know who the people are, and you cannot actually even guess it by checking their data. And then you do analysis, and then when you do analysis with that data, you could have sometimes, well, 60,000 observations. Or, I have worked with census data, you have 24 million people in the census. So that's the microdata. You have the actual full data, with each observation for the whole full of variables and questions that were asked to the people. You could do this the same for one community, and there may be only 50 households, and you may only have few variables, but it's still the microdata. You have it. And so when you do the analysis, you compute indicators from that database. And that often is just aggregate the data. So you may produce data for women and for men, for children, for disabled people, or for different regions of the country, for example. And so you start producing aggregated data. So if I have the microdata with me, I can produce the aggregate data. But sometimes you don't have access to the microdata. It could be, for example, that the microdata hasn't been made available. So for example, in some countries, the data is not made available, only the Office of Statistics has the data. Or for example, a university or a research center have done a research and they have the data, but they don't share it necessarily. No, maybe for a good reason, maybe that they are protecting people who responded to the survey. They don't want, to violate the privacy that you have agreed with them. And so in those cases, you often go to look at aggregated data. And that aggregated data is normally done at a macro level, so country level, regional level. And so you have, for example, life expectancy. Life expectancy is never at an individual level, because to compute life expectancy, you need to look at the mortality rate, the mortality table for the whole age group in a country. And then applying different demographic methods, they come up with the actual life expectancy rate, which is a really good indicator, but you would always have it aggregated. So you have it aggregated at the country level, you would have it for men, for women, you would have it for regions and so on. And so those are more macro data. And so that's roughly the distinction between the two. And economists love to have microdata, or well, sociologists and so on. Some people love to have macro data because they look to do more analysis at more macro level. So it depends on the question that you are answering as well. You may look at data different levels.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that, Jose. So a question that came to my mind when you were talking specifically about using mixed methods approaches. And so I think often within the capability approach, we kind of see participatory approaches as perhaps a gold standard. One of the strong justifications for not incorporating more qualitative work or more participatory work is the resources available. We simply don't have the funding to do that kind of work. So my question to you is whether participatory approaches and mixed methods approaches should be considered more of a gold standard, and whether we should be striving for them when we actually do have those resources available.
That's a good question. I mean, is it a gold standard? I mean, it's great to be able to have both, right? As in, they both provide you really good information. I think what I would say on that, what I often tell to my colleagues and friends, is that the key is the research question, right? So it could be that you approach a research question where there's already a consensus in a certain area. And so when there's already a consensus, then perhaps, you don't, the participatory method would reach the same, the same outcome that you already know. And so maybe your question is going in another direction. But it could also be that there's a level of consensus and you want to question the consensus. So for example, you may have the SDG defined in a certain way, and you want to question whether they really capture the whole extent of what matters. And yeah, you can use participatory method. Now you could also, you can also consult people in different ways, right? You can also consult people with quantitative method. You could also do surveys where you consult much more what people, care about. And so, for example, when it comes to weight, there are ways in which you can ask, and there's of course research done in this area, where you ask people to try to assign, importance to one area of their life to another. And so you can then justify why you're assigning certain weights in certain way than another. But, you could, if you are working at a smaller scale, if you're doing, for example, an evaluation in a community, and you actually can get really good focus group and in-depth interviews. So, you can do really good workshops where, you can use, I've seen Robert Chamber doing fantastic work where he get a community to value what matters more to them. And you can then use that in quantitative. So I think you are right that you can use them much more together. And I think in general is great. I mean, right now we are working on a research both in Tanzania and Vietnam, and it's a mixed method. So we're doing in-depth interviews and focus group, and we're doing a quantitative survey together. But having said that, using them together is not exempt of challenges as well. And the biggest challenge you find is when they tell you different things, right? You can triangulate qualitative and quantitative, and sometimes they come to different conclusions. And you are in a little bit of a challenge there on how you are going to interpret and what would you, so using them together is not necessarily easier. Well, certainly not easier. It's another challenge, and it's and you will face other issues that you need to address. But there's great work in that in using both together. And I think when you come down in a scale, when you are working in communities and projects, are more and on a scale that is more achievable to do more qualitative participation, especially, then it's a no-brainer. You should do it. When you are looking at a bigger scale, then still you can do them. And for example, when you look at the MPI index that are national level, they have done in-depth interview with people in different communities to understand what the situation is. But to this systematically, it would have to be something like the Voice of the Poor or the World Bank. It's like projects that are really time consuming. So I think just to make the point that the scale of the research, not only the resources, but the scale would also justify why you go one way or another in your research.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. That was some really, really great insights.
I agree. Thank you so much both for the talk and the discussion that has followed so far. So I'd like to sort of turn my attention to, and perhaps yours as well to some extent, to sort of the relationship between what you call the evaluative spaces, but also dimensions or domains, and in turn, the indicators that we might use to get information about these things. So we often have this kind of a plurality of evaluative spaces. And by that, I presume that we're sort of interested in both, say, functionings and capabilities, or perhaps also refined functioning sometimes. And as you mentioned, sort of theories can be very complex and difficult to put into research. And sometimes the more interesting a theory is, with the more moving parts there are, say, the more difficult it can be to put into practice. So one thought I had in relation to that is that it appears more difficult to measure, say, freedoms or opportunities than it is to measure states of being and doing, or resource holdings for that matter. And I guess I'm a bit curious about whether that is any cause for concern from a capabilitarian perspective in your view, or whether, yeah, these are just sort of things that we have to deal with in one way or another, and there are many ways of going about it.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, Sebastian, and I don't think it's a sort of a concern. I think it's just the reality of what we are facing, right? So reality is complex, values are complex, and the capability approach is not trying to, to avoid dealing with that complexity. So I think that's absolutely fine. And I think then in the way that you measure it or put it into practice, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, you are going to look at, you need to try to look at sign of what you are, trying to answer. And so if you are interested in opportunities, you may be choosing certain type of functionings that you observe, but you may also be looking at the functioning across time, for example. And there's discipline and research in other areas that is really, really helpful. So for example, you have a lot of work on social mobility in sociology. And so you can go and consult research on social mobility in sociology and see how they have come to assess whether the educational system, for example, is fair, and it allows different, people from different backgrounds to then being able to progress in life and get to the same levels. And so there's different way in which that's been done, right? And sometimes, yes, you may look at income. Sometimes you may look at progression in life. You may look, for example, there's a lot of work around men and female and how women at a certain age, especially when they start having children, may, separate from their male counterparts. And so there's some issues there around, you can discuss the whole thing about care. But what I feel is that by connecting with other disciplines, we learn. And so what other disciplines perhaps don't do is that they are not looking at well-being in the way we do, but they are looking at phenomena that we're interested in. And so we can connect between both and then do analysis. And we're contributing to the debate, not only within the capability approach, but we contribute to the debate within the other disciplines. So I think I just see it as an strength, and it's, it's where you would develop your narrative in the research that you're doing, and it won't be only quantitative either. You know, you would also have quite a strong theoretical basis, and you may, you know, like we said before, may support with qualitative research and so on. So I think is we should embrace it. Is the conclusion, right? Like we should embrace it and work with it.
Thank you. That's incredibly interesting to hear. I suppose in relation to this sort of openness to different perspectives on approaching things, we have a question from one of the attendees, Anna Melnick, who first begins by thanking for the very inspiring presentation and asks about different sort of meaning local communities assigned to different capabilities, and perhaps more generally, the relation between capabilities and moral values. And the question is sort of as follows. So are there suitable methodological approaches that can capture these relations to reveal what is a meaning that people assign to different capabilities and how this is informed by people's value system?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not aware directly on research that have been done just like that, but I imagine it's possible, and probably there are people working on it. When it comes to meanings, that's of course much more subjective, a subjective experience. And so if you are working in this area, I would recommend you to go to look at the way in which both sociologists and psychologists work with issues of meaning and values, and how they measure it. If you are trying to measure it, no, that is. And so they often use scales, and you know, you would have, for example, we are right now looking at coping mechanisms of mental health, and so people, when they are in a stress situation, they may react in different ways, and so you can find out what are the sort of core package. Let's say package. This is through scales. You see what are the different type of responses that people have to stress. And so in terms of meaning, you can do exactly the same. You would have scales where you are asking people, you have a statement. It's a Likert scale, but you may have a statement asking people to, in a statement, to say how much they agree or disagree with the statement. And you have a range of statements. And then using factor analysis, you can then group that into factors, which factors are constructs. So they are like conceptual variables that are behind the statements. And so certain statements that go together, they behave together, may be referring to certain type of meanings that people attribute to that capability. And so you may end up, with a structure of factors. So my recommendation then would be to, look at, if you don't find in the capability, look at working both sociology and psychology and how they work with this type of more subjective skills.
Thank you very much. I think Kate might have some more empirically informed questions to get at, so I'm gonna give her the word now.
Yeah, so a few questions, just on those empirical aspects, Jose. So in regards to aggregation, I suppose to firstly put forward that I have probably a little bit of bias against aggregation. So from my personal view, I feel that dashboard approaches tend to be more valuable for policy. But I can also see the other side, that aggregation could be useful for targeting of services and supports and so forth. So perhaps it would be great to get your view on when you think each of those approaches is valid, and what are the justifications for each.
Yeah, so both have their space, right? Definitely. Probably the best is to be able to have an aggregation with the dashboard, so that you still have the dashboard and you have an aggregation. But it depends on, I'm going to go back again to the context and practicality. Depend when you're going to use it, how you're going to use it, what is that you're going to do with it, right? And so if your intention is to communicate it, right, and you are using it for policy, and you want to drive a public debate and public deliberation about issues of poverty, then you probably want at some point an aggregation, because you want to be able to explain it in simple words. And then you want to move into the dashboard and go into detail and talk about health, education. But you want to be able to say poverty is definitely going up or down, and you want to explain it in ways that people understand it. So that's probably why the MPI, you know, the different MPIs, the way in which countries apply MPI have been so successful, because people ultimately need to communicate it, an aggregation. And an aggregation is also a final assessment. So you want a conclusion. I recently, with some colleagues from ODI, finished a report where we look at the Leave No One Behind commitment of the SDG. And we are looking at different dimensions. We look at health, education, nutrition, and so on. And we look at different groups. The permutation in the analysis is so wide, it's rich. So we actually work for most of it with a dashboard approach. And it's rich. You say million really interesting stuff, but it's difficult to come to a conclusion, or a simple conclusion rather. You have a complex conclusion. And so the dashboard approach there helps us a lot to talk to nutrition, and you may do policies in nutrition and talk about education, but having an aggregation also helps. So we did have a section where we would have showing how the aggregation helps. And so what, in general, it all depends on the question, the context, your data, but in general, it helps to have the aggregation, and it helps them to be able to unpack. And it helps that when you unpack, the dashboard is really well tied to the index, so you can see the connection. And that's what you can do with the MPI. That's why I think that help with the MPI. So you have an index that is the weighted of the dimension. You can compute the contribution of the dimension, and then you can go at the indicators and talk about them. So you still have the dashboard, but you have the aggregation as well. So having both help. But having said that, in other contexts, you may want to go for fully aggregation. So for example, when you are looking at the drivers of well-being in certain more econometric type of analysis, you may just want to have a full aggregation of well-being and look at in more detail the drive and the conventional factor and so on. And so there's really good work, for example, there of Jaya Krishnakumar, where she is already aggregating, but she's looking more at the causation and how that leads to the final index, rather than necessarily what is happening in the different dimensions. So it depends on the question that you're having. And in the work of Yaya, because it's a structural equation, is of course much more complicated to communicate, but what you are assessing is really systematic, and you are looking at the relations between different variables, and so you get to a sort of more in-depth analysis of the model that you're looking at. But it's of course much more complicated to communicate. So if normally you would need someone else who does the translation to policy, and probably won't even refer to the numbers. It would refer to something else in the process.
Yeah, and that's a really good plug actually for our next webinar in this series, because Jaya Krishnakumar will be part of the panel discussion, discussing these approaches more generally. But just to, I suppose, have one follow-up on that, and then we'll go back to Sebastian. You just mentioned that kind of trade-off between being communicable to policymakers, but being robust in methodology. And so as scholars, how do we balance that in terms of being clear and simple, so that policymakers can understand what we're putting forward, but also using, I guess, a technical and robust approach?
Great question. You see, when it comes to knowledge, you may at some point sacrifice communication completely. and say, let's just understand it first and then communicate it. So that's, you may at a certain point go that path. And so then you would make choices based on it. So no, I think it would depend on where you are at, right? And what is that you're trying to achieve in a particular time. So yeah, I think that that it comes back to what's your research question, what is your audience, what is that you want to achieve with the paper, and then you make your choices. Definitely.
Thanks, Jose. Very, very wise words.
You can use qualitative, of course, as well, and participation there.
Sounds excellent. I'd like to sort of start off this part with a question about the data that is collected for some given measurement application, whatever it might be. I suppose such data collection comes with a few responsibilities. And one of our attendees who remained anonymous says that data security is one of our sort of world concerns nowadays, and wonders if you have anything to say about, say, data security and cyber data, and especially with regard to how important it is for future use. And I suppose
that's a great question. I mean, it sounds like the person asking the question knows way more than I do about this. But maybe what I can just say about it is that there's the traditional world of data gathering and analysis, where, the surveys, census, administrative record, and so on, where there's already quite a clear standards on how you protect the respondent, both during the time of data collection, but also once you have the data. You anonymize the data. Sometimes you don't have that many numbers. You have to even aggregate the data, so the person cannot even see the person in the data. So there's quite a careful processes to protect the respondent and protect people during those type of research. But when it comes to new form of data, especially online data or big data, then we are in a kind of a new territory where we are really learning incredibly. I mean humanity, and both, right now there's a huge call for social media, for example, or big tech companies to regulate themselves as well in the way that they use and share data. And so it's all I can say, I think, is that it's very complex there, and it depends on what you're looking at. It's of course, the potential is huge, because you can access incredibly good data for good purpose. And so something that I invite us to do as academics is to think more on how we can make use of that new data, and how we can make use of that new data for good purposes, right? Which is gonna, mean to be creative in many different ways. But yeah, the protection of people and individuals is central.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We have another question, I suppose, on how data can be used in terms of publishing. And I believe Gareth Wall might be able to join us to ask his question, which will be the final one before we move on to the closing comments.
Thanks, Sebastian, and thanks, Jose and Kate and Raphael for organising the really interesting discussion and presentation. We've talked quite a lot about values within the research process, particularly methodology. We talked about participation and a little bit about data and the values of there. So on publishing, I know that wasn't the topic of your presentation, Jose, but if you have any reflections on where researchers like ourselves and the association broadly, but also the whole sector, including our close partners like the World Bank and the Human Development Report Office, can look at the mismatch between the values we place within our research methodologies and our publishing methodologies mainly, maybe, but things being open access, being able to be in multiple languages, that sort of discussion. Maybe you have some experience from SAVE or from OFI where they've actually gone out their way to think about how they engage communities that are reflected within the data that are being researched on to be parts not just of the methodological process of getting the data, but also of distributing and having them involved. But any reflections would be great. Thanks.
No, that's Gareth. Great to hear from you anyway, Gareth. And that's a great question. And that has, the answer could be huge. But let me just explain at least one anecdote that I have from one time that we presented some work. It was from Save the Children. We had this database we've been working on that was measuring inequalities in child survival and education and nutrition, global inequalities between groups. So we were looking, for example, inequalities inside Nigeria between regions and ethnic groups and gender and so on. And we were calling for at the time, that was before the SDG were agreed, we were calling for governments to look at inequality, to go beyond what MDG did and look at inequality. And the way we compute this data is from many household surveys that are, collected across the world. And you can think on how many people have been interviewed there. And what it was interesting is that the point of my story is that Robert Chamber was there in the seminar, in the room, and he said, "This is just fantastic." And he said, "What I think it'll be great, wouldn't it be great if the government would commit themselves to publish those figures of inequalities in ways that is accessible to people in newspapers or, I don't know, in different materials that people can access with infographics, perhaps, not the actual hard numbers, but something that people can actually see and understand, that shows the level of inequality and gaps that are seen in Nigeria, for example, or any other country. And that comes down to a little bit what you're saying, so we are collecting a lot of data, and through the UN system especially, we are collecting and gathering data, but I refer to all of us, could communicate that much more in a way that we empower communities and we support public deliberation, because it's that public deliberation what ultimately is going to lead to greater change. So I think that that example say a lot in relation to what you were talking, because then of course we publish papers in academic journals because we are engaging with our community, but also because we have certain type of motivations. It's not necessarily so easy to communicate in other contexts. In those journals, anyway, the access to the journals is not often not open access and so on. So it all adds to a huge question, and a question that any researcher deal with constantly, because they do often have to publish in those journals because it's what is required, but they also want the data to be used. They have collected maybe data in communities. They want to go back to the communities and share the finding and engage with the communities. They may have done, maybe 6 months of in-depth research in a community, and they want to come back and exchange and share, but they do it to an extent, but they feel that they should have done even more than what they have. And so it's a challenge that we all face. And I think, especially for those that are in the capability approach that cares about social justice, we are constantly assessing ourselves. Are we doing the best that we can? Are we, using the best means that we have at our hand and so on? Maybe it is a question to have, more of this discussion in the association, because I'm sure there'll be some really good learnings and experience for different people.
Thank you, Jose, for your insight and sharing your experience with all of us. And thanks as well to my colleagues for organizing this together with myself, and especially to the audience whose questions have really made this come alive, I think. So thanks to everyone. I'd just like to leave the last words to Kate. So please take it from here.
Thank you also, Jose. This has been a really great discussion, and I've certainly got a lot out of it. And I think many of the attendees will have as well. So as was mentioned at the beginning, this is a webinar series. So this is the third session of the series. The next session, as mentioned briefly before, will be a panel discussion with Jaya Krishnakumar, Julia Greco, and Enrica Chiaperi Martinetti. And it will be a really great follow-on, I think, to this much more broad discussion of methodology, as in this panel discussion, which is on the 18th of June at 9 a.m. British Summer Time. Sorry. We'll discuss much more practical applications and specific examples of these kind of methodologies being utilised. So I very much encourage you to come to that discussion. It will be promoted through the HDCA channels and also through Eventbrite as a follow-up to this session as well. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, afternoon, evening. Thank you all again for coming, and looking forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks all.